Welcome. I'm Bill Hartung. I'm a senior research fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. And I'm glad you could join us for our panel on President Eisenhower's Chance for Peace speech, which was given 70 years ago this week at the American Society for Newspaper Editors. It was a remarkable speech, especially given when it was, given and who it was given to. It was a searing indictment of nuclear buildups, excessive military spending, and also, I think, equally or more importantly, a call to set out on a new path. So we'll get into the details of the speech in a little bit. First, I want to say a bit about the Quincy Institute and introduce Susan Eisenhower, who's been kind enough to join us today. Quincy Institute's an action-oriented think tank dedicated to moving U.S. foreign policy away from endless war and towards vigorous diplomacy that would promote international peace. You can follow our work at quincyinstitute.org, quincyinst.org, quincyinst.org. And also you should take a look at our online magazine, Responsible Statecraft. As I said, I'll be joined by Susan Eisenhower, Ike's granddaughter, and an accomplished expert on national security issues. She's written and spoken extensively on international issues. She's worked as an essayist, an op-ed writer, an editor, a biographer. She's written hundreds of op-eds for newspapers, including the Washington Post, New York Times, Los Angeles Times, as well as longer pieces for National Academy of Sciences, Issues in Science and Technology, Naval Institute's Proceedings. Interestingly, early in her career, she wrote humor for the Saturday Evening Post, which I imagine was quite a fun occupation. And she's written her most recent book, which is highly pertinent to today's discussion, How Ike Led, the Principles Behind Eisenhower's Biggest Decisions. So welcome, Susan, again. And we're going to watch a short video and then get right into it. We'll have a discussion and some time for Q&A.
Wonderful. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to be with you today.
President Dwight D. Eisenhower entered political office in 1953, with the Cold War on the horizon. Stalin had just died, and the decorated war hero turned president saw a chance to break from the path of confrontation with the Soviet Union. And he warned Americans of what an unending arms race would cost our society.
What can the world, or any nation in it, hope for if no turning is found on this dread road? The worst to be feared and the best to be expected can be simply stated. The worst is atomic war. The best would be this: a life of perpetual fear and tension, a burden of arms draining the wealth and labor of all people, a wasting of strength that defies the American system or the Soviet system or any system to achieve true abundance and happiness for the peoples of this earth. Every gun that is made, every warship launched, every rocket fired signifies, in the final sense, a theft from those who hunger and are not fed, those who are cold and are not clothed. This world in arms is not spending money alone. It is spending the sweat of its laborers, the genius of its scientists, the hopes of its children. The cost of one modern heavy bomber is this: a modern brick school in more than 30 cities, 2 electric power plants, each serving a town of 60,000 population. It is 2 fine, fully equipped hospitals. We pay for a single destroyer with new homes that could have housed more than 8,000 people. We pay for a single fighter plane with 500,000 bushels of wheat. This is, I repeat, the best way of life to be found on the road the world has been taking. This is not a way of life at all, in any true sense. Under the cloud of threatening war, it is humanity hanging from a cross of iron.
There are two distinct paths before us. Either keep going down the road we've been taking, or change course. The tab for the war machine is still being paid for by the American people. And every dollar spent recklessly on militarism robs Americans of the fruits of their own labor and the hopes for their children's future.
Well, I think that gives a good flavor of the speech. And unfortunately, we're grappling with a lot of the same issues that Eisenhower raised back then. I wanted to ask Susan, what do you think prompted Dwight Eisenhower to give that speech at that time?
Well, it's interesting. I think the first speech he was planning to give was Atoms for Peace, that he actually gave later that year on December 8th, 1953. But as was pointed out in the movie, that Stalin had died in March. And there was a big debate in the administration about how to handle this unexpected situation. As a matter of fact, Eisenhower asked for the Truman contingency plans in case of Stalin's death, and there weren't any. So they had to really debate this issue anew to figure out exactly, how to frame the events that had just occurred in the Soviet Union. And Dwight Eisenhower might have been a great soldier, but he was also a man of peace. And he made it very clear that he wanted this speech to be about what the Soviet Union could join the United States in doing with this particular opening. And Bill, actually, I'd like to add to that a few people really put it this way, but he is the first president of the hydrogen bomb era. That program started in the Truman administration, and one of the big tests occurred just before he was inaugurated. So this is really a kind of plea to assure that we didn't have an arms race around one of the most lethal weapon that has ever been devised by mankind.
Yes. A lot of the principles of his, exemplified in the speech seem to carry through in some of the other policy decisions you discuss in your book. And I wanted to note a few of them and then sort of ask you sort of how you saw the development of his thinking and his decisions at key points in the light of some of the themes of the speech. As you note in the book, although he was a military man, he also pointed out that because he had been in the military, he had enormous knowledge of the amount of fat that could be cut from the Pentagon budget without undermining our security. He was against having a strategy of going everywhere, defending everything. He wanted a more kind of restrained, focused strategy. He argued that, the basis of our security was in a healthy population and a strong economy, not just spending on weapons of war. So, to what extent was he able to carry those through at other key moments, do you think?
Well, it's a great question. Let me just start by reframing a little bit the speech itself. It's got all of the elements of what he called the Great Equation. And that is that if you think about national security as a stool, a three-legged stool, then there were three legs to the national security of the United States, thought Dwight Eisenhower. One, of course, is our military capability and our capacity to deter the Soviet Union. The second was the state of our economy. And the third was our moral authority in the world. So those three legs of the stool were what he focused on in his administration. I mean, I think it's rather remarkable after ending the Korean War in July of 1953. He went on to assure there were no combat casualties in the United States of military after the end of the Korean War. And furthermore, in his administration, he managed to balance the budget 3 times in 8 years and come very, very close on another 2 occasions, leaving the Kennedy administration with a budget surplus. So you see what I mean about this interconnectedness of this equation. And then finally, in his last year and a half in office, he did 3 round-the-world trips, visiting countries as diverse as Afghanistan, and of course the Koreas, and I should say South Korea. And all of these trips were designed to show America to be a friend of those countries. He, by the way, was the only president to go to first president to go to Afghanistan, and the last until after 9/11.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. He had a lot of forces to contend with.
Mhm.
The hawkish wing of his party wanted him to roll back the Soviet presence in Eastern Europe. They criticized him for not intervening militarily when the Soviets invaded Hungary. And the military men, the Pentagon, and the hawks, roundly criticized his kind of keeping a lid on the Pentagon budget. Came in, give or take, $300 billion a year with a slight uptick at the end in today's dollars, less than half of what we're spending now. So that was a very interesting back and forth that he had to contend with. What was your sense of that in terms of, the pressure that was on him when he had to make some of these key decisions?
I think he was under enormous pressure. But one of the reasons he decided to run for president, and I would say that this was a reluctant candidate, that's for sure. For 6 years, he was being courted by the Republicans and the Democrats. As a matter of fact, Harry Truman even volunteered to step down as president to make the way for General Eisenhower to become president, assuming that Eisenhower was a Democrat. But Eisenhower focused his attention on the isolationists in the Republican Party. The Republican Party had been out of power for 20 years, so he felt that not only did American democracy need a vital 2-party system, but that if Robert Taft, who was Mr. Republican and likely to get the nomination, were he to win, that the isolationists would come to power in the United States, and this would be the end of everything he'd worked for during World War II and in the aftermath of that. So, Bill, I think there's another point I want to make too, which is sort of about his philosophy, and this is where, again, the pressure came. He did not believe in small wars. He had seen Nazi Germany throw absolutely everything at it at the very end, and he believed that if you were engaged in an existential war of some kind, that nuclear weapons would eventually be used. So he tried very hard to avoid small engagements, and when he did, he always had robust contingency plans in place. And finally, let me say one other thing, which is really what he would have said was the essence of a great power, is that a great power can't do everything. And he believed in restraint. I mean, boy, that's an old-fashioned word, isn't it? Restraint. And that's what he demonstrated in certain very tricky situations. He had a very good sense of timing, obviously honed during World War II, and he allowed time for people to cool off. And then he used robust diplomatic effort to keep these from turning into small wars that could turn into big wars.
Now, the other big fight, of course, which led him in his farewell address to coin the term military-industrial complex, was in the nuclear sphere. There was a big push from industry, from hawkish members of Congress, including prominent Democrats like JFK, LBJ, Stuart Symington, both to build a new bomber and then to say that we suffered a missile gap, that we were falling behind the Soviet Union in the production of intercontinental ballistic missiles, and therefore had to do a huge buildup. And some of the forces behind that were from his own administration, and they were kind of speaking out of school, because after all, he was the commander in chief. So, you know, a lot of that is still with us. You know, the industry pushing particular products, Congress adding more money to the Pentagon budget than it even requests. I know there was a small anecdote in your book about how you had stepped down from a think tank, from their board, when they took money from weapons contractors to fund national security studies. Of course, that's rampant now. My colleague Ben Freeman has written reports on it, on the tens of millions of dollars and more that go to key think tanks that opine on everything from nuclear policy to policy towards China, to what we should be doing in Ukraine and so forth. So, you know, in the light of what we're seeing now, you know, how do you think that battle played out, you know, in the Eisenhower term? Obviously, he wasn't completely happy with it because he warned of the ongoing danger of this sort of military contractor alliance.
Well, I have to tell you that for me, the most uncomfortable part of that story, just think about it. It wasn't just the political forces in the Democratic Party or even in his own party that wanted more defense spending, but there were some of his colleagues from World War II. You want to talk about insubordinate? I'm sorry, but Maxwell Taylor and some of these other individuals who were out, you know, leaking. I don't know whether Taylor himself did, but the Pentagon was leaking information to Capitol Hill that was based on studies around Soviet Union's potential capacity, not about their actual capacity. Then, you know, all of this finds some culmination in a way when the Soviet Union launched the first artificial satellite, Sputnik, into space. And what's sort of ironic about that whole story is that not only did the United States know they were going to launch a satellite into space, we had an agreement for both sides to launch satellites into space. And the Soviet Union was so eager to be the first to do it that they completely failed to realize they were trapped into verifying the free access to space because Sputnik orbited the Earth. You know, they wouldn't allow open skies, for instance. They wouldn't allow U-2s to fly over their property. So it was not at all clear that they were going to agree to free access to space. In any case, these are complex things, a lot of different pressures. So after Sputnik, Eisenhower did something that I think was really quite revolutionary. The military, for instance, had their own lobbyists up on Capitol Hill lobbying for more weapons and the rest of it. And after Sputnik, he used that crisis to bring about some real defense reform that not only placed budgetary matters in the hands of the civilian Secretary of Defense, and believe it or not, they didn't have that authority up until that moment. He reorganized the Defense Department and eliminated this kind of the right to be doing this kind of lobbying. Now, I guess in this he failed because certainly after he was gone, that whole system reverted to a much more aggressive system where those who might be in a position to benefit were the ones up lobbying against sometimes the president's own policy. And we saw that in other administrations as well.
Yes, it was interesting. You mentioned in the book that he very much was not sympathetic with the kinds of wish lists that the military would bring to him and to Congress. Now wish lists are actually required by law, and there's a fight by Senator Warren and others to roll back that provision. But they create the basis of things like these tens of billions of dollar increases in Pentagon spending.
Well, I'd say that's absolutely remarkable. As a matter of fact, General Goodpaster, Andrew J. Goodpaster, who had been SACEUR, the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO forces in the 70s, also former superintendent of West Point, et cetera, magnificent man who I'm so honored to be under his wing for many, many years. And he was Ike's day-to-day national security person. He told me that he was standing at the president's desk when the president was looking through the defense budget with his red pen out, crossing stuff off. and he looks up to at Goodpaster and says, God help this country when somebody's sitting in this seat who doesn't know as much about the military as I do. And not only did he say it to Goodpaster, he also wrote it to one of his childhood friends. So we've even seen him use that allusion in writing. I just think it's a very interesting little note there.
Yeah, there's a lot of debate that's based on the money. If we spend less money, we're less secure, without looking at the content of that spending. So we've got dysfunctional weapon systems like the F-35. We have massive nuclear overkill. We've got a lot of contracting out. More than 500,000 private contractors work for the Pentagon. Robert Gates, when he was running the show, said he actually didn't know how many. They couldn't keep track of them all. So there's a lot of things that don't contribute to security that go into those dollars. But, the hawks act as if, if we cut by 5 or 10%, the world would go crazy. It would be chaos. It would be, as opposed to a lot of these decisions being made by world leaders based on either security concerns or, their own lobbies, as we've seen, internal pressure.
What's sort of extraordinary about this is I believe it's a matter of law that the Pentagon is supposed to produce an audit, and they have been unable to do that. So that you have to wonder how it is with the defense budget this size that we've even run out of the inventory to sustain the commitments we've made to Ukraine. I don't know whether we have seen the authoritative word on that particular problem, but we certainly read about it in the newspaper. And if it's even half true, it is rather extraordinary that we would have made those commitments without knowing whether we could see them through or not.
Yes, I think there's a couple elements that I've seen. One is there's a very strong preference or pressure towards high-tech systems, new bombers, new combat aircraft, new aircraft carriers, hypersonic weapons, artificial intelligence, and a neglect of kind of more bread and butter systems that might be relevant to a conflict, like things like artillery shells and so forth. So I think that's part of it. But then there's the flip side is I think the industry has seized this moment to say, well, let's pull out our wish list of how we want the military industrial complex to look in the future. So let's reduce scrutiny of companies. Let's push things out the door. Let's prevent provisions against price gouging. So I think we have to watch in the context of helping Ukraine defend itself, what the industry's sort of parallel agenda is, which I don't think necessarily has to do with helping Ukraine, it has more to do with helping their financial bottom lines. And so that's a little bit hard to parse, in the midst of this crisis, but I think we have to definitely keep an eye on it.
Yeah.
So I guess, I think as in the Chance for Peace speech, in the military industrial complex speech, Eisenhower ends with a note of hope, or at least a call to action, saying that we, if we're going to blunt the possibilities on unwarranted influence by a permanent arms establishment, we need an alert and knowledgeable citizenry. I think that's still true. How do you see it in today's world where we've got misinformation, disinformation, people more interested in entertainment than serious policy issues? Are there ways to bring the public more in touch with some of these bigger issues that really require action on their part?
Well, I mean, it's a great question. If you'll allow me just to make one observation, the Chance for Peace speech obviously starts at the beginning of his administration, and the farewell address is, a lot of people call it the bookend to the Chance for Peace speech. But when the Chance for Peace speech was given 70 years ago this week, there was no military-industrial complex to speak of. And so this is a phenomenon that grows, I would say, pretty much, or at least took flight, as it were, from Sputnik onwards. And he could already see in that short period of time how radically transformational this phenomenon might be. So it's very it's an interesting unintended bookend that the alert and knowledgeable citizenry element of this comes in at the very end, because he realizes that in some ways this is a parallel set of influences that could have an impact on the choices that might be made in the foreign policy arena. And so we have seen these pressures continue, but ultimately, I think we all have to recognize that this is a question of leadership. And it's regrettable maybe that not everybody knows as much about the military as Dwight Eisenhower did, but it doesn't, it should still, the current event should still motivate Americans to be deeply interested in the commitments we make, in the causes we're associated with, and to think clearly. Let me just add, let me just add one other thing, is that a stool of this, well, I should stop using that expression, but the news media plays an enormous role. And I think the one thing we have to factor in today is both the presence of cyber activity and also the news media and, the accuracy of the news we're getting on any subject, especially consequential in the foreign policy arena. So I think we've got a very complex time now. And it could be, I would say today's crisis is way more dangerous than it was back then, even though we didn't know the other side that well. Bill, I can't hear you, unfortunately.
Sorry, there was a siren and I muted myself.
Oh, I see.
I don't know what the siren was for, but I didn't want people to have to listen to it. So there's a lot of questions in the queue. One was sort of a historical question. Why did I extract the word congressional from military-industrial complex? I've seen mixed reviews on that. There was one book on the speech by James Ledbetter that said, in fact, he doesn't think that was an issue, whereas there's been other articles saying he was going to say military-industrial congressional complex, but he felt he wanted to acknowledge sort of a sense of comedy with the, respect for the Congress, and therefore left that out. Have you heard anything about that aspect of it?
Well, from what I understand, congressional was not, it might have been in a draft, I don't know, but I'll tell you what the attitude is of the Eisenhower family, who has to give permission to scholars who want to read about these speeches or go into the drafts. Certainly, my father, the late John Eisenhower, Ike's only surviving son, was quite clear on the fact that if the president, it was not the president's speech until he got up and gave it. And so I don't know whether one of his speechwriters ever put congressional in there, but certainly Ike himself was a great speechwriter. He had been a speechwriter for Douglas MacArthur in the Army, and he would have had strong opinions about every line that was proposed to him. I think that there's a chance that he didn't think congressional was appropriate because he enjoyed an extraordinary relationship with the Democratic leadership, or even the Democratic side of the aisle in Congress, despite the fact that they were in power for 6 of his 8 years. And he was not also a kind of finger-pointing type of person. You noted that in the speech ends on a positive note. I can say, having known him well, I was almost 18 when he died, that he never stopped being optimistic. And I think that, can be shown in so many ways. And I tried to illustrate some of that in my book. So I think it's a little debate. You get also a debate along similar lines with the McCarthy chapter back during the campaign. But, just because a speechwriter suggested something doesn't mean that Eisenhower agreed with it, let alone took it out for other reasons. So I think this is one of the things we'll never be able to settle.
There's a question about some of the personnel in the administration who's, had a more hardline image and promoted things like, action in Iran and Guatemala, particularly Dulles brothers. How do you see that? How did that interaction play out? How did Ike see that?
Well, I think one thing that was very interesting for me, and I have to say that having known him very well, I learned a lot from writing this book because in my family, we had kind of a firewall between his professional career and our personal relationship with him. But in reading, in researching this book, one of the big surprises for me is how much architecture had to be created to produce the administration that is called the Eisenhower administration. So he reorganized all kinds of ways that the system would work internally, including empowering, for the first time, a real chief of staff like he had during the war. I say this because one of the things that had to be reorganized was actually the CIA's relationship with the President of the United States. It isn't until 1955 that the CIA are in effect reined in and accountable to the executive branch because they were founded to be an independent organization. And that's all I can really say on that subject. I'm not an expert on the intelligence community, but I think the Dulles brothers, in a way, were part of the forces that were reined in, as it were, in that 1955 reorganization. Then they came into the intelligence community came into a system of very highly motivated accountability. And that had to do with how they organized cabinet meetings. The president actually, on a weekly basis, attended National Security Council meetings, and they also had cabinet meetings once a week. And there was somebody there who enforced the president's decisions after every one of those meetings. So they tightened things up big time from 1955 onwards. Not always successfully, by the way, but they were certainly making a concerted effort.
There's a couple of questions about the war in Ukraine, which of course is a very complex, difficult subject. My own take is it's important to give Ukraine what it needs to defend itself, but also have some sort of diplomatic track idea, even if it's not on the cards currently. Is that something you have thoughts on, or?
No, I think I would agree with you that Ukraine must have what it needs within some strategic limitations, right, to defend themselves. I say this because we're not going to be moving nuclear weapons onto their territory, et cetera. But I do think, I don't know whether we're going to label this diplomacy or what, but we absolutely need to have more contacts and we need to be talking more. And I say that not because this shows any appreciation for the Russian Federation or anyone else. Talking is about, trying to gain some understanding of how likely things are to go off the rails and get, significantly worse. If you read the history of the Cuban Missile Crisis, there were a lot of back channels. Even within the administration, there were a lot of back channels, and those back channels played a pivotal role in averting a nuclear catastrophe. I personally lose sleep at night, quite literally, because I don't think we've got enough of those back channels to assure that if something were to happen, like a miscalculation or something in the nuclear area, that we would have, a robust set of contacts that we could engage to try and iron out the facts of the matter. So if that kind of back and forth ultimately leads to diplomacy, as long as the conditions are the right ones, then we've got another tool in the toolbox. But certainly right now, I don't feel a high sense of comfort about the amount of interaction that I think would be required when you have 5 nuclear powers involved in this crisis. and a robust cyber activity that much of which is being orchestrated by quote unquote volunteer armies on both sides of this conflict.
Yes, and I think, one element of that, which started well before the Ukraine war, was the dismantling of the global nuclear arms control regime, going back to the U.S. pulling out of the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty,
Right.
even New START, which is kind of the last remaining U.S.-Russian arms control measure, is in the balance if it's not renewed in a few years' time. Inspections have stopped. Is there a way to, in the concept of sort of having a parallel track, trying to put those on the agenda, or does the war just take them out of consideration for some period of time?
I'd like to emphasize that you have these contacts not because you agree with the other side, but you have these contacts for our own national security. I mean, it's not just Ukraine that has national security issues here at the moment around this crisis, because NATO is involved. And if you follow the rhetoric that's coming from both Russia and China, they have, the rhetoric is pointing to a strong set of complaints about the United States of America itself. So we have an obligation to the American people to assure our own national security. And since much of that is based around strategic weapons, we have an obligation for the American people to be engaged in those talks, not to reward anybody on the other side, but to avert any kind of danger that might be associated with miscalculation. And I've heard many outstanding experts on this talk about how much more dangerous it is today than it was during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And let's not forget that the Cuban Missile Crisis ended not as a showdown, but as a compromise. And nobody's even suggesting that. I think the first step is just to reestablish those working relationships around nuclear weapons.
Yes, so I think that's a task going forward, and a lesson from what was done in certainly the 50s and 60s, and
Right.
after the Cuban Missile Crisis. One of the questions was, are we just giving a history lesson here? What are the lessons going forward? And I think, communications, contacts is certainly one of them. I think another is just this concept of restraint, that you can kind of push back against these endless calls for more from the military services, from the industry, from the members of Congress that they fund, that a president who's strong enough and is willing to stick to his principles can put sort of a lid on that. And we haven't seen that sort of thing in quite a long time. But I wonder if, absent, strong presidential leadership, are there ways to get a handle on these kinds of buildups?
Well, Bill, I'd say one of the lessons here, and I think part of the reason I wrote the book is I thought Dwight Eisenhower still has a lot to say to us. His leadership style was entirely different than what we see today. He did not mind, indeed thought that there was strategic usefulness to be working behind the scenes sometime. Now today, because of social media, everything's got to be done out in the public. People say things, or they say things to other people that would be best left unsaid if you have a very specific goal you're trying to pursue. He was also a great strategist, so I think at least people have told me that they've learned some things about strategy from reading this book. And then finally, around restraint. I mean, we don't know that word very much anymore. But another phenomenon of our culture, I think, and I hate to say this to the listeners of this podcast, but I think competitive sports has a lot to do with this. But everything's about winners and losers. And it didn't used to be that way in the past. We didn't have a culture that says, if you're a loser, you're hopeless. And so even the configuration of winning and losing becomes almost, central to a country's identity, et cetera. And America certainly reflects that, I think, on some occasions. So restraint means that you are giving things time, and sometimes time can be the most valuable strategic tool of all. I'm not trying to draw a direct comparison with this particular crisis, but even the crisis in the 1950s with respect to China and Quemoy and Matsu, again, restraint ended up avoiding a situation where things got completely out of control.
I think another lesson for now was his point that we need to have our own house in order. We need a healthy population. We need a strong economy. We can't become a garrison state. President Biden certainly has invested and tried to invest more in domestic affairs, including his Inflation Reduction Act and so forth. But if you look at the contrast, that is going to come out to about $37 billion a year, which is a tiny proportion of what we spend on the military, $886 billion proposed. Congress will only add to it, and it's separate from aid to Ukraine. So we're pushing towards what could be $1 trillion on the military in the next couple of years. And the contrasts are stark. I mean, spending on the F-35 this year is equivalent to the budget of the Centers for Disease Control. Just two of those planes could help us double what we spend on railroad safety. And there's a whole other list of examples that groups like the National Priorities Project have calculated, and also we've done a fact sheet and some other background on this very point. So to me, finding a balance between what are the biggest threats to us, are they only military? What about climate? What about public health? What about just knitting our society together and dealing with things like inequality?
Well, if I could just, as they say, double click on that one. Part of the great equation is a coherent look at the American way of life, and a coherent look at protecting that American way of life. And I would say that one of the greatest dangers to America's national security are the political divisions in our country. Not just the divisions between our policymakers, but you're beginning to see more and more American people regarding their fellow neighbors as enemies and the rest of it. And this is very dangerous. As a matter of fact, I quote him in the book. Eisenhower says that the deep division, this is quote, the deep divisions in the United States are a welcome sight for an alert enemy. Unity and the capacity of this country to work together shows a kind of internal strength that sends its own signal to those who oppose us. And this is why I've become a registered independent. I don't want to enable either party to pick unnecessary fights when everyone is watching, and they're watching all over the world.
Now, the last thing I thought about in terms of lessons, and we'll see if we can then squeeze in some other questions, was his sort of statement or posture that we can't go everywhere and do everything militarily. And if you contrast that with the recent National Defense Strategy, which talks about being able to possibly fight or win a war against China or Russia, have military contingencies or Iran or North Korea, continue a global war on terror that includes 750 military bases, hundreds of thousands of troops overseas. It seems to me that concept that we need a focus and can't go everywhere, do everything, what I call the cover the globe military strategy, is a lesson that needs to be learned.
Well, I would say that the one thing I think Eisenhower was particularly adept at was prioritization. And again, what I tried to do in this book is to prove that Dwight Eisenhower, the general, was the same person as Dwight Eisenhower, the president. You can't be in war with limited resources and even limited intelligence or understanding of the situation on the battlefield without a kind of prioritization, not just of resources, but prioritization of goals and means and methods. So this prioritization is not something we know how to do anymore. People are afraid of the fight. They're afraid of the debate, to talk about what General Goodpaster used to call the long poles in the tent, which are the long poles that hold up the tent called the United States of America. And are we tending to those poles to make sure that one of them doesn't fall down and therefore bring the entire tent down with it? But there are ways to think about this, but prioritization has to be a big one. I think because certainly in Eisenhower think, without prioritization, the task is just unaffordable.
There was a follow-up question about essentially how would you galvanize the public for a more peaceful, less militarized foreign and military policy? And there's certainly organizations working on that. There's a Pentagon budget campaign that's transpartisan that works on this. There's a group called People Over Pentagon that's coordinated by Public Citizen and includes a lot of groups that have concerns about neglect of other issues, be they environment, be they immigration, and so forth. The Poor People's Campaign, led by Reverend William Barber and Reverend Liz Theo Harris, has as one of their planks trying to rein in the war machine and the war economy. There's groups like Dissenters, which is a youth anti-militarism organization out of Chicago. But it takes, I think, so much to break through in the kind of communications environment we're in the climate of fear that's pervading the country. But do you see sort of hope for that kind of alert and knowledgeable citizenry that was part of the military-industrial complex speech, or how to reach more people to think and act about these critical issues?
Well, I think this is the way I would think about it. I mean, I'm a little bit skeptical about the success of speaking about reducing the military budget at a time that everybody will acknowledge this country is in the middle of a global crisis. It's not just over the war in Russia and Ukraine, but tensions are rising between the United States and our allies in China. I don't know how that's going to play out. I personally, if I were in charge, I would be working much more in, certainly with respect to China, just sort of taking some of the heat out of the dialogue, because you can be planning for the worst case scenario, and every military should do it. But I do think that a lot of tension is created just by the way we talk to each other. And, the question of Taiwan and the rest of it is a complicated one. So I would say that what we ought to be doing right now is to be laying the groundwork for a different way of allowing debate in this country about America's place in the world. We've got a new, you're seeing slight inklings of this in the upcoming presidential election, but we shouldn't be afraid of that debate because, to your point, Bill, we're everywhere and we're greatly extended. So the question is that even ultimately effective? Or does our presence in certain places actually make the situation more complicated rather than less complicated? Or are we leveraging the assets of our allies to take up some of this burden? And what is really the state of our alliance? We had one of the key members, Emmanuel Macron, go off to China, and I'm not sure that everybody, at the higher levels of the United States government were briefed about that. In other words, this is a highly complex time, and I think most people are going to want to be assured that we have the military capability to meet our current challenges, but there would still be no excuse for not allowing a robust debate in this country. And as well as I do that in Washington, there are big constraints on how much people can talk about that very issue, about what the most secure posture the United States can take in what is emerging as a multipolar world, whether we want it to be that way or not.
Yeah, no, I think some realism would go a long way in this context. There was another short question. What happened to the optimism we had in the 50s and 60s? Now, I think you could argue what proportion of the population was optimistic, but even in the height of McCarthyism, you had groups like SANE and Women's Strike for Peace that pushed and helped create the Partial Test Ban Treaty. Of course, you had the Freeze movement of the 80s, which helped turn Ronald Reagan around on the notion of military buildups versus nuclear reductions. There was a recent documentary about how the Vietnam moratorium headed off what would have been a disastrous escalation planned by the Nixon administration in Vietnam. So, there are moments when the public comes together and when people who maybe didn't think of themselves as activists rise to the occasion. Are we at a moment where that could happen again? I think there is a lot of dread about the climate problem, about the discord in the country, to some degree about whether the media is up to the task of kind of parsing all these complex issues in a balanced fashion. Is there kind of a grounds for hope, even if it's hope for what we can accomplish over, some period of time?
I think there's total grounds for hope, but then we have to decide that we've got a problem and certain things aren't working. I mean, let's put it this way, and I certainly make this point in my book. My book was really designed in a certain way. It's a leadership book, really, but it's designed so that I hope readers will understand who this man was and how he thought about solving certain problems. But I'll tell you, one of the most moving things for me, I think we've completely forgotten how catastrophic World War II was. 65 million people died in those short years, and it was a cataclysm. And Ike says, and I get into this in one of my chapters, about, I call it the loneliness of power. I don't think people realize what an Eisenhower, for instance, and every leader is different, but in his case, he believed that one of the big parts of his job was to stay optimistic all the time. And if he had any worries, to take them to bed with him. Confide only in his pillow. I think he described it that way. Why is that? Because you can't get people to go into combat if they think they're going to lose the war in the first place. Optimism is absolutely central to morale. And this is one reason the 1950s were a period of optimism. I mean, he passed the first civil rights legislation since Reconstruction in Congress. It was his legislation. So there was hope for everybody, including, by the way, the African-American community. He, enforced civil rights by sending in the 101st Airborne Division to Little Rock. In other words, the country was on the move. We were building infrastructure and this and that. But at the heart of it all is that he deeply believed that everybody in the United States deserved to be a full citizen and deserved to have equal opportunity. And the only way that could happen would be reframing everything in a positive way. So we're, just to conclude on this little point, and this is Susan talking here, I think we're our own worst enemies sometimes. How about we just get up every morning, and I teach a group of undergraduate students, and I say to them, we can do this. It's going to require talking to each other differently. It's going to require asking more of our members of Congress to spend maybe a little bit less time for a while, going on long breaks, etc. Staying in Washington a bit longer to pass some legislation around, or some regulation. I mean, in the AI community, they're begging the government to regulate them. And for some reason, this doesn't seem to be a priority. The point is that we can do this. And we have to keep telling ourselves we can do it, and then we will do it. If we say that it's all hopeless, and then it will be hopeless. And that's why I get out of bed every morning, and I have to maybe leave some of my worries, with my pillow. But I just think it's part of my responsibility as an adult to tell my grandchildren and my undergraduate students that that we have everything we need in this country to be a great country again, to treat our fellow citizens with respect and a sense of community, and to do the same overseas. But this is going to take a long time to get to that point where we can, we're able to relearn that particular quality.
So we're getting close to the end. Are there any last thoughts you want to share? I mean, that was a really good kind of way to end. But do you have additional thoughts you want to share before we close up?
Well, I want to thank everybody who's tuned in today. And if you want to talk about an alert citizenry, people who participate in podcasts and webinars and all the things that are now available to the public since we learned how to do it during the pandemic. I mean, all of you I know are working hard to make this country a better place. And I am optimistic. I've got a group of undergraduate students. I like the way they think. They've come out of a very, very tough time with this pandemic, as all students have. But there are reasons there are reasons to believe that we're going to be just fine, but it means that all of us are going to have to make a commitment to all of our neighbors and to our communities. So thank you, Bill, for this great opportunity. Nice to see you again after a number of years, and best wishes to everybody.
Yes. No, it's been a little while, but we were part of a forum at Gettysburg College on the, I believe, 50th anniversary of Ike's military-industrial complex speech. So, the work goes on.
Yeah.
I want to thank Susan, everybody at Quincy who helped make this happen. Again, quincyinst.org, quincyinst.org if you want see our past seminars, get on our mailing list. There's 2 upcoming events. On April 24th, an event on dark money and U.S. foreign policy talks about how undisclosed money from special interests is seeking to influence our foreign and military policies. And then there's an event at MIT, which also will have a streaming element on Grand Delusion, the rise and fall of American ambition in the Middle East, which is based on a wonderful new book by Steve Simon, who's a non-resident analyst at the Quincy Institute, and he'll be in dialogue with the chair of our board, Andrew Basevich. So don't be strangers. Tune into future events and connect with us. And, the more the better. Thank you.
Thank you.